need to pull up this mic, or does it pick up my voice? Yeah, I can just talk. Okay. So I don't think our panel really needs that much introduction. Suffice to say that this is an illustrious C-level executive suite that we have going here. We have Michael Hennessy, who's the CEO and president of the CMPA, Canadian Media Production Fund Association. Sorry. We have Valerie Creighton, who's the president and CEO of the CMF, the Canada Media Fund. Jay Jolly, who's the CEO and founder of Over Interactive Media. And Alexandra Raffi, who's the president and CEO of Thunderbird Productions.
No, not just the head of productions.
Head of productions.
Yep.
So we have a great group of people here who are going to help us create a conversation. I think Jeff was rightly in kind of saying that we are entering an era of listening. And this era involves you, the audience. And so we want to make this, this panel discussion be as interactive as possible. So what's going to happen is I've created a question for these guys to answer. We're going to talk a little bit more, and then I urge all of you to jump into the fray and ask questions, and hopefully we'll have quite a heated and informed discussion about the future of the digital entertainment landscape. So, as you guys know, the sort of purpose of this panel, as per the brochure that Christine has beautifully created, is we're supposed to discuss the challenges that everyone's facing, producers, funders, creatives, and they still face despite this move towards convergence. We are looking at whether or not we've achieved the targets and objectives we've set out in making convergence a priority in the CMF. And we're also looking at what should we change in understanding our current reality and what is needed for us to become a truly convergent community in Canada. And I think that the best way to get at some of those problems and or challenges and solutions to those challenges is to look into the future. So Michael, it's 2020. What does the digital entertainment landscape look like, and how has some of the mechanisms that we have in Canada, like the CMF, evolved in terms of its vision, and programming?
Sure, no problem. I did have to discount a couple of things. So anything that might happen in terms of impending nuclear conflict in the Middle East, while an interesting example of disruptive technology, I took off.
Great.
I thought it was outside of the scope.
Yeah.
Similarly, the financial collapse of 2013, 2014. I ignored, although there is an interesting anecdote around that, where a young girl in Des Moines actually did a video on YouTube which went viral, and it was basically, she asked the question, she was only 12 years old, asked the question that her dad had lost his job, and therefore she'd lost her allowance because he didn't have any money. And if all the banks in the world didn't have any money, then how could anybody get their allowance? And that was kind of the tipping point where people realized the gig was up. It turned out later that there really was no 12-year-old girl, that it was a rogue trader at Goldman Sachs. But again, we discounted that. So, all right, so warming up to 2012. Audience will be the only measure of success. So when we look at how the system works today, identifiably Canadian content, various criteria for values, audience will be the only measure of success. And I would think that the people that control analytics, metrics, are going to make a lot of money over that period of time. Broadband will be maybe almost the only vehicle for the distribution of content, and basically what that'll be broadband in terms of fiber, in terms of switched video, the combination of mobile and Wi-Fi to deal with spectrum problems, and essentially what you get out of that is by 2020, broadband will have killed the broadcasting system. So over the top will cease to exist as a concept, since television, film, newspapers, magazines, everything is going to be on broadband, and therefore it will become a meaningless concept. Broadcasters, as I suggested, are going to disappear, starting with over-the-air broadcasters because their spectrum will be taken, reallocated for mobile purposes. But I think the future of the broadcaster and the future of the cable distributor is bleak at best. But going with that, therefore, the concept of a broadcasting license really isn't going to have any value, and everything that streams from that, that's built on that premise, falls apart. And that's because in an online world, where going back to the OTT model, smart TVs, open internet, the distribution of content in that kind of world has already bypassed that kind of protected system. Not to say that everything's going to be a la carte. I'm still a big believer that aggregation and curation will continue to be critically important, and there will be various ways people will buy content. But in the world of aggregation and curation, the big players are going to be Apple, Google, and Amazon, and certainly they will be the dominant brands, not the CTVs and globals. The CBC as a broadcaster will disappear, but I think whether it's the CBC combined with the NFB or something like that, they will have a very significant online premise, and ultimately they will become a vehicle for the distribution of a lot of content, the curation of the library, and even the promotion of Canadian content to international markets. The vertical integration model being pursued today that everybody's worried about will have collapsed, and carriers will retreat to running managed broadband networks and making incredibly high rates of return as a result of that. Physical media from books, newspapers, DVDs will have disappeared, except perhaps for collectors. But along with that will also disappear the concept of actual ownership of content from a consumer perspective. Increasingly, in my view, consumers are going to rent, not own their libraries. And that, has some very important issues around it. The future of the CMF, in my mind, the CMF is not going to exist by 2020. It will either probably have been, undermined by the broadcast distributors that will have found a way to stop contributing to the system, and will have cut their funding moments before consumers cut the cord to their businesses. Many of the incentive plans that production is built on today will collapse, but not totally, because I think government will ultimately realize that in the kind of economy we're moving into, that the creation of content from software development to the kind of storytelling world we're talking about will be fundamental for jobs, economic growth, and export markets. And so we will see, I think, a move back to things like tax credits, like grants, money's moved over from spectrum auctions into digital content strategies, that type of thing. Rights clearinghouses and places that perform analytics, so the control of rights, the control of information will create new wealth, but again, I think only the biggest brands will really profit the most from that. I think, if you're in the production business, the control of your intellectual property, whether you're in digital content, well, everything will be digital content, but the control of your intellectual property will be critical, and your power, because of all this shifting, the ability to control your intellectual property will be really determined by how good you are at engaging and dealing with your audience from the creation of projects in whatever media you want to start in. So that's my lead.
So just a quick question. So are you saying that the pipe owners are really just going to be the pipe owners, they're neutral, it just becomes about, making tons of money, having content flow through their pipes, and that there's not going to be any effort on their part to try to own that content or to try to manage?
Yeah, no, I think it's kind of simple if you because I came from both the cable and wireless business, and when you really look at it, and you're in multi-billion-dollar corporations, One of the principal questions you always ask yourself is, if I have $1 of capital to spend, what do I spend it on? And people are pretty indifferent in these kind of corporations to whether, it's content or pipe. And the real issue is, what's the return on investment? And on the return on investment, for instance, on putting the money into wireless broadband is probably 40% EBITDA. The return on investment in a program or in broadcasting is something that is not very large, is high risk, and is declining. So ultimately, there are the people that own spectrum as well as fiber are going to go back to that. They will get into the idea of managed networks, of finding, building analytics into the system so that they can sell that back to parties and that kind of business. That's their business. That's where they'll end up. Anybody that doesn't have a wireless play is probably dead as a carrier. And one can assume that the number of carriers we see today will be less, and that you'll start to see integration in that part of the market.
Great. Valerie.
Do you know your glasses are really dirty? Let me do this. When he was talking, I looked at my glasses because mine are all scratched. And then I could kind of see Michael's from the side, and I thought, Jesus, Michael, like your glasses are really dirty.
But
try that.
The problem is, if you clean my glasses, you can look into my eyes and see how dirty my mind is.
Oh, I've seen your dirty mind before. It's something to behold. So I actually think Michael's right about a lot of the points he raised. And it was interesting, when he was talking, I was reminded of a conversation I had the privilege of speaking to the producer and broadcast community in Copenhagen last year, because everybody was so curious about this Canada Media Fund and the convergence of TV and digital, and what does it mean, and what's working and what's bullshit and what's collapsing and all that stuff. So I was invited over to speak to them, and I heard this wonderful story from the head of the Producers Association there, how about a year ago, I think, he attended the big technology market in Europe with the head of their cable conglomerate in Denmark. And in the room was this massive television screen that covered the wall. And the cable guy got so excited, like he was just, frothing at the mouth. And so they went up and they started looking at this technology. And as they looked and pursued it and looked all the way around it, the cable guy kind of went from the red heat of excitement to orange to yellow, and turned green when he realized there was no outlet for a cable portal on that piece of equipment. So that to me was an anecdotal story that kind of supports a lot of what Michael has said. My view is a little simpler, perhaps, and a little more focused on what we do in this country. And maybe it's a Pollyanna naive glass half full, but I certainly do agree that this transition to a global digital environment that we're in this mess and chaos and change of at the moment will be, if not complete, certainly way further down the road. And the phrase that I think really we need to focus on a bit is we'll all be living in this economy of attention. And it's, how do you get that attention? And where do you drive that attention? I happen to believe that as Canadians, we still value this country, and we value the stories this country has to offer, and we value the content we make. I would be the first to say, I don't think collectively, and many of you have heard me harp on this for 10 years, I don't think collectively as an industry we've done the best job of positioning that content in the minds of not just the guys who drive the money, because the people who make money will always make money. That's not going to go away, and they'll probably make more money. But in the minds of the money people, in the minds of the government people who make decisions, and most importantly, the minds of the public, I don't think we've done a very stellar job of positioning what this industry does, its impact on this country, and its impact on how the world thinks. Not just about Canada, but about ideas and idea generation. And I still stand on the ground that says our content in this country, regardless of genre, speaks to the best of who and what we are and holds shoulder to shoulder with content all over the world. So my terror in all of this is how do we, as a country, ensure that that content is focused in this economy of attention? How do we make sure we have a place for Canada in all of that? Because it's very easy for us to get swept away with the thousands of ways to consume. I don't think TV's dead in the least. In fact, I think our attention to content viewed on a big screen is only going to increase. I think there's going to be these huge monstrosities where people will gather in their little caves with your friends and your family, and there'll be split screens like this where you'll have the content on one side and the ability to Skype and hook the people who aren't with you in that particular room into what you're talking about. I mean, it's all happening now. It's just a question of how it will converge. And you guys all know the stats probably better than we do here. But I think the world, the technology aspect and the technological ability to move across those platforms and connect, I think that will change too. It's going to have to, because the market, the people who want to make the money will follow what the consumers want. And people want that ease of access. People my age, I turned 60 this summer. Thank you very much. Retirement's coming soon, like tomorrow would be good. But, you know, people of my generation that aren't technically savvy, the way many of you are that work in transmedia every day, we don't want to have to fight this stuff. We want to be able to turn it on and have it work. Like the minute I have to stop and get my daughter to figure it out is the minute it's over for me. I'll go read a book, right? But I want to be able to turn on, like today, I came in here and couldn't get the iPad to work. I don't go find out how to do it, I just give up. Like I just do something else. So we want that ease of technological transfer. And that will happen. It'll happen more and more where you can turn on one button and you'll get it across all the platforms and it won't collapse or it won't, you know, forget to connect to wherever it's supposed to so that you can actually access the content. I think the whole point about delivery, it will certainly be, and Jeff spoke about this quite brilliantly, platform agnostic for sure. I mean, it won't matter anymore, and we get all in this twist about, oh, you know, what's happening, and where is the money in the digital side, and show me the money, and all of these conversations. And, you know, that's kind of the same conversation that we've had on the other side of content in feature film and TV for a long time. And I think the only way we will, as a compelling nation, and you guys are the ones who produce these extraordinary stories, regardless of their application for film, television, and transmedia, will be just what Jeff said. I mean, it really is about the story and the idea and what makes an audience or a person want to watch it in the first place and stick with you on it, whether it's, you know, taking that feature film and spreading it across different platforms, or the TV series, or the transmedia application. Brand, I think, is really important. I don't think we've done a good job in Canada branding the country. And, you know, when we're having these conversations around the project I'm working on for Telefilm in the CMF, that comes up a lot. And it's like, why do we need to say it's Canadian? Who really gives a shit at the end of the day? If it's good, it'll stick. And that's partly true, except you can turn to and look to what happened in the music industry in this country on the whole regulatory environment and the fact that there was a criteria for so much play on radio stations. And look what happened to the artists in Canada in terms of music. And we didn't quite get that chance on the TV feature film side. Yes, it was regulated, but not to the extent when you have, you know, 2% of your screen times available in the country. You don't get to show you the stuff you make to your own citizens. So I'm just kind of tired of standing on the 49th parallel looking up. I know everything we do is tied to the Broadcasting Act and the television application. I think all that will change. I think Michael's right. I think the systems around us are disintegrating before our eyes, and that causes a lot of fear and distress. But I still, when I look around at what we see coming into the CMF, boy, the opportunity for the content creator to connect with an audience and drive that content across a myriad of audiences, not just in Canada but worldwide, has never been better. And I think that's the really exciting part. I happen to believe, in spite of my, you know, faith and support of our distribution and broadcast systems, that isn't going to hold. It isn't going to last. But I don't think that means that, you know, the TV viewing screen, however it's delivered, is going away. It's just we're going to have more of all, more connectivity, and really, I think it's going to be a much more interesting environment. You know, will organizations like the CMF or all of our funding agencies survive? Who knows? And it's not really that important. What's important is that we have a base in the country for that storytelling. These have been the mechanisms today. And that's great, and they've worked very well, and we've all been privileged. You just go outside of this country, anywhere in the world, go down to the U.S. and talk to the independent producers there, regardless of the medium they're working in, or anywhere in the world. We've been so privileged in this country to have the kind of financial support from our governments, federal and provincial, from our BDU players and the moneyed people in the system. And a lot of that's come begrudgingly, yes. But what's happened in Canada, I've been at the fund now, I'm finishing off my 7th year. Yeah, I know you can probably hardly believe that. I certainly can hardly believe it. But when I first came to the fund, we weren't talking about television content that had 2-3 million viewers regularly in the country, let alone holding 6 million in the US. We weren't even talking about the word transmedia 7 years ago in the way we are today. So we're really new at this, and there's been lots of mistakes, and there's lots of stuff that doesn't work, but there's quite a bit that does. And I think our real job, regardless of the structure and system, who drives it, whether it's broadband, probably you're right, whether there are other ways of doing this, is to position this content so that the public gets it and buys in and values it and sees it and recognizes it, which will lead to some type of support, however that support comes down the road. It could be organizations like we've got today or not. But the ability to get that content to an audience, that's one thing I totally on side with Michael on. You know, you're making this stuff, and if people aren't responding to it, then you got to move on to something else. I mean, it is about audience, and it is about driving that. But a great story will stick. We all want that as humans. We want it to resonate. We want to feel like we've learned something, listened to something, and you can point to hundreds of success at the CMF history, mostly kids, historically, but certainly increasingly docs and dramas. And people still want to watch that. People are still proud when they find out it's Canadian and it's done well and we're entering the market in a different way. That's just my experience when I talk to the community out there. So, you know, what'll happen 2020? I think, God, my hope is we've got the country saying, not having to talk about the fact it was Canadian, because our content, the success of our content in the past and future is in the cell structure of people, that we're not standing on the 49th parallel looking up, that we engage in a way we allow the system to allow our creative production and creative entity to really engage with the world and be present in the world, and that we're highly successful. It'll never be successful to the point that there doesn't have to be some kind of support. You can make the jobs argument, you can make the industrial argument, you can make the creative story argument. To me, those aren't separate and distinct. They're all part of the same piece. And, you know, we've had conversations in this country for years. Oh, we shouldn't be in the Department of Heritage. We should be in industry. Oh, we shouldn't be there. We should be here. Well, the fact is it doesn't matter where we are. Because if we really do a good sell and brand job of what you guys make and how you take it to the world, that support will be there because it will be of value to the politicians, the funders, and most importantly to the public. So that's where I want to go. I want to get every Canadian in this country celebrating what it is you do.
So for two next producers, I mean, we've heard, you know, content's king, pipes are king in a way because they're the ones that are, and essentially one of the things that we still haven't heard is this notion of the co-creation part. So we're still talking about telling good stories that we give to a public to consume. Is that what it's going to be in 2020?
So right away, before I say anything, I actually believe that everybody that sets out there, from a broadcaster to a director to a writer, everybody believes they're telling a good story. So let's just fundamentally agree that no matter how much I talk about something that might seem like technology, although I try not to, what I try and talk about is execution and what we can actually do that's actionable and meaningful, and it can kind of empower us. Everybody always sets out to tell a good story. They might not execute on that, but that's another thing. But to kind of riff on what we've heard, absolutely. Like when it comes to the pipe, whatever form it takes, even if it's city-wide Wi-Fi, it's just a utility, and it's how you use that utility. It's where that faucet is. It's how, as a creator and both as an audience, basically where I want to watch it and where I want to serve it up on a democratic platform will be king. On top of that, I really look at audience like equity now, and I've started to kind of look at this more and more and more. and as someone who does partner with broadcasters and producers and is actually moving into production as well, not just being on kind of the vendor side, which, you know, for a long time, and it's places like Merging Media that finally, like, the idea of new media is not ghettoized, it's not bolt-on anymore, it's not the last thing people think about it, it's not just another RFQ, that we're starting to move to a point where we're actually at the table right at the beginning, and we're as important as a writer, and we're important as the producer and stuff like that. And I believe moving forward, that's going to be a fundamental, and especially once you see things kind of, let's just call it, be increasingly more disrupted. And when I talk about disruption, what we have to realize is if there was ever a poster boy for disruption, it's the last 100 years of media. Media is, by definition, disruptive. Everything is always replacing something else. And if you want to, like, basically understand the path of where media is going and where storytelling is going, you start by looking at the path of technology. Because, you know, like I like to say, someone invents a radio, someone else invents a radio play. Because people, creatives, always look for a way to exploit a piece of technology to get their story out there. Now, the interesting part about that in the time we live in, and even something that more resonated for me even when you posed that question, was, you know, 4 months ago, I had a son. And by the time he reaches age of majority, the world will be a fundamentally different place. So I kind of, you know, when you asked that question, I kind of sat back and said, 20 years, wow. So does anybody understand the concept of Moore's Law, where technology begets technology exponentially? Well, and that's basically the concept anyway. But more importantly than that, when you add another layer that's called singularity on top of that, which, you know, some people, there's a lot of arguments about, but basically it's the amplification of Moore's Law that is the time we're in, where everything is so high velocity that we have to be very agile and nimble in no matter what we do. So whatever I'm doing today, I'm learning, and what I should be doing is finding a way to apply that to be earning tomorrow, rinse, wash, and repeat as many times as you want. So when I look at the world in 20 years, well, it's actually when Michael said, you know, look at, you know, a financial meltdown, look at a war, all of these things actually affect what you do in this room at any given point. Like, the two most disruptive forces right now could be Facebook and an AK-47, and I believe that. There's, you know, when I kind of look at things of where nanotechnology is going, where artificial intelligence is going, where the human genome is going, that's all influential in the story and how it's going to affect us as a culture and how we tell those stories. What the biggest problem that I believe media, linear media in the industry has right now, they're losing the millennials, and it's like a big dirty secret. Even in Quebec, as successful as their cinema is, only about, I think it's less than 20% are under 35 that really engage in it. Most of that audience is actually an older audience. So if you really want to start understanding, understand that millennials, that's the churn that this industry needs. We need to fill in new audience members. And the audience is basically consuming content, taking stake in content, finding content in a radically different way than any generation that's come before it. And this is increasingly changing, and we need to be, again, if we want audience in the future, we need to connect with those people yesterday. And that's where kind of my business is really focused, is kind of looking at how do we attract those millennials, how do we get them in, how do we discover new talent, how do we de-risk new stories, how do we build audiences earlier than ever before, and how do we reduce the discovery process to that, the means to that end. And absolutely, analytics is a big, big part of it. But analytics is also paralysis, so we need to make them, again, meaningful and actionable as we move forward. What was another thing? So in terms of audiences equity, one of the things I've been really doing, especially I've got, a lot of people know me by the digital agency and the work we do with kind of film and TV. But out of that, we created a vertical from a playbook that we created, that we learned working on properties like with the CBC, like something we did with the Weinsteins and so on and so forth. And we realized that there was a way actually to disrupt $1 to $5 million independent films. The great thing is Canada's a perfect place to do that because we do have a great infrastructure. We do have great partners like Cineplex Odeon, like a Michael Kennedy. There are genuinely people here that might be, as you described, C-level, but are very, very passionate about creating content for the audience. So when you look at whatever you're doing, stop looking at it in a straight line. Don't look at it like, I'm going to write a script, and then I'm going to get a producer, and then we're going to get a broadcaster. Try and think of what the audience is at the end of it, because that's basically, that's what Palo Alto does every day, and that's why they're successful. They don't design from the technology up. They design from the user experience backwards. The technology doesn't matter. It's the execution that's technology enabled. I could go on. I think I passed my 5 minutes, didn't I?
That's
okay,
good.
There you go.
All right, my vision 2020. I have no idea. I do remember, though, your point about technology. 20 years ago, I remember being in England and calling my home phone to get messages using a little beeper thing. Remember those? And my mother going, "That's magic, darling. What is it? That's absolute magic. Couldn't believe it." I didn't have a cell phone 20 years ago. Didn't use email 20 years ago. Unimaginable 20 years from now. A few things. I agree that the pipeline is going to be agnostic. I don't think that I think the audience will be king in a very significant way. I think that the people that are going to be making money are primarily those people that are helping the audience navigate and find the content they want without having to surf through a bunch of dreck in the meantime. So aggregators are that. I am mindful of the fact that entertainment on this large scale we call radio, television, that's more feature films, etc., is about selling toothpaste. And I think none of us can forget that. All of these, again, I'm going to assume the creative, that the content is intended or certainly aspiring to be terrific and engaging and blah, 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 and all the rest of it. But the money to make that, television started about companies, brands sponsoring entertainment to sell their product. It is still about that. I mean, I challenge you to talk to the broadcasters tomorrow and when it's there, or later on today when the panel is like, the bottom line of all of this is broadcasting isn't a public good. It's not a public service. Valerie comes from CMF. There are sort of things that Canada desires for itself, but there are also for-profit enterprises that are about making a profit. And that means having content that's so great or so well communicated or so well mined on their brand that advertisers will put money into the machine. And that really is the bottom line about that. The discussion of transmedia, I can't answer the now questions. I think we're all struggling with it on a day-to-day basis. It's the most fun I've ever had in my life, playing with these whole new ways of amplifying the storytelling world. I do agree it's about amplifying the storytelling world. I think we do far too much of we need an app. Well, so who plays it? I mean, anyway. The other thing I'm mindful of is not every property is a transmedia property. I do not believe that. Our company had a small brain fart a few years ago and bought a 50% share in the Blade Runner franchise. That's a transmedia property. That is soup to nuts. It's an entire universe. It's everything Jeff Gomez was talking about, and you can extend this prequel, sequel, sideways, additional characters, previous characters. It's an entire universe you can take across all elements of storytelling. But not every show demands that. I'm mindful of the conversation about books. 10 minutes, he's waving. Books, which is we have completely different expectations of a book of poetry than we do of a historical novel, than we do of an airport blockbuster, than we do of a piece of higher literature, than we do of a textbook. They are all equally valid forms of communication. They all serve a different purpose. They all serve a different audience. They all have a different cost associated with their manufacture. Not every project should be ubiquitous. Not every project's worth it. Not every project needs to be in order to sell the toothpaste that the initiator wanted. I think that the largest, I'm also mindful as a producer, which is, all of this is all very well, but nobody works for me for free. So I still have to gather a significant amount of coin because traditional media, at least where you have people walking and talking and moving, at the moment is still extremely labor intensive. It's a lot of people. It's a big machine. And that takes a lot of dough. And at the moment, we acquire our dough partly through subsidies, God bless them, but partly through the pre-selling of territorial rights. And what we're seeing now, right now breaking down, is the territorial boundaries. And we're going through our contracts with a fine-tooth comb going, did we actually give them the Netflix rights when we sold, Latin America? Oh, look, we still have them because Netflix hadn't been invented then, and the wording of that language, gave us the rights. Oh, shit, the wording of that language was all-encompassing, and they had the rights. I mean, we're all mining our paperwork from all our existing IP to see what nooks and crannies we can continue to exploit for more cash. But the reality is over the next few years, I, the consumer, am going to refuse to say, oh, I went onto Hulu and it said, I'm sorry, we've detected you're in America. Well, you're not in America. Well, I know how to get around that. Everybody knows how to get around it. It's like, we will not put up with the territorial barriers. So where is my money going to come from? My money is probably going to come back to toothpaste. It's going to be on this kind of agnostic platform. I want to watch it on my iPad lying in bed. I want to watch it in my TV in my living room. I want to watch it on my phone. If I want to look it up, I don't care what the pipeline is. I want it all instantly. There's going to be a huge amount of work that's going to have to be done in interface design. Whether or not we will end up with, iOS and Android or Windows as competing sort of beta, VHS, Blu-ray, DVD, these kinds of things, I don't know, but my guess is people won't put up with it. They're going to want to get their content. They're not going to give a shit whether it's Apple or whether it's Microsoft. They're going to want it on my toy. I think that we're going to end up by being full circle back to brands, because consumers do go for brands. If brands will represent this kind of content, these kinds of storytellings, these kinds of talents, and I think that's where we're going to get our financing to make things in the future. Advertising is going to have to become content.
What about people like Louis C.K. or Amanda Palmer, where essentially a whole slew of new producers are going direct to their fans to essentially make their living?
I think you have to be somebody before you can do that. And I think that's very much about an in-front-of-the-camera face to do that. And I think they're also pretty subsidizing them. I mean, my understanding is that a lot of them have been kind of front-end subsidized and back-end successful, rather than, hey, give me some money, I'm going to do something cool.
Well, what's happening now is, there are these new technology entrants that are allowing the direct pre-sales of your content. Yeah. So essentially, you can capitalize a production by pre-selling that with a treatment and things like that. So
yeah, but it's hard to raise $15 million doing that.
Yeah. Part of the question, and I think you raised it when you talked about wars and the financial crisis, is in 20 years, do we need to start thinking about sustainability differently? Whereby, maybe it's not about creating a company that's going to generate $10 million a year. Maybe it's about creating a lifestyle business for yourself where you're generating $250,000, maybe $150,000 to $250,000 a year.
I mean, that is all part of it. One of the reasons that, when you live in a broadband world, things are more interactive. There's a lot more ability to engage with your audience in the creation and development of things in the first place. But people love big product. They love branded product, I mean, what's the greatest transmedia thing ever, right, is Star Wars, right? Like, people like the big budget stuff. Now, there will be lots of opportunity for the smaller stuff, but the smaller stuff in many respects, even the Louis C.K. stuff that you're talking about, is ultimately the idea of using the tools you have to create an audience and ultimately to sell that audience.
I don't think there's going to be a one-way. No. Right? I think in the same way, you go back to my sort of poetry and airport blockbuster analogy. The same thing is true of feature films. There's the expression of artistic intent. We overly use the word auteur, but there is I absolutely have something to say and I'm going to make a movie because that's how I express myself kind of filmmaking. And then there's going to be, Spartacus, which is spectacle filmmaking, and there's room for all of these on the web. I know people who are making children's stories in a transmedia way, and I know people who are doing crowdsourcing for build your own storytelling. But there's so much language as yet unexplored, that there's going to be all kinds of content, and it's going to have same way as it does now. It's going to have different price tags, different parameters, and be aimed at different audiences. The people that are really going to make a lot of money are the people who figure out how to take something like, the Kindle's Genius, the Amazon, the Apple Genius thing, and make it work. So that I actually do say, well, gosh, I really love that film by Fred Bloggs, and it actually spits up 15 films that actually are of a same piece, rather than, why the hell did you throw that up?
And I think there's something inevitable that happens to everybody, right? You get older.
Really?
To the extent, you're successful, you're also often in a period where you're having children, you take on a mortgage, you suddenly have employees, you have responsibilities. And what seemed like a lot of money initially when you were younger is not anymore when you're responsible not only for a family and debt, but for a family of people that work with you in the collective. And, audience remains demanding all the way through this process. So I think that, there's scale is still going to be incredibly important, and, as we were saying, brand's important.
I think brand's going to be
Yeah, I
important.
don't think there's going to be one way either. I mean, there'll always be the smaller production entity that does certain things that they need, that they want to say that works for them, right to the other end of the scale. And, again, and we do all of that in Canada now, and some of it's quite successful and some of it isn't. It's not that everything we do hits. And I think we've measured the content, even whether you talk about the feature film side on the box office model or the CMF on the pure market plus public policy model. And, what's interesting about this time and also terrifying is all of this research, testing, trying, figuring it out, crowdsourcing, finding your audience in advance of even stepping into the treatment. All of it's it is disruptive, but it's also, through all of that chaos, something will start to emerge that will make more sense. And all of, I hate to tell you, but all of those really innovating, fast-thinking, smart, creative types like Jay will get older, as Michael says, and, pretty soon there'll be, hopefully, another whole generation who will replace that.
Yeah, but he's a guy, so we never grow up.
Oh, yeah, I forgot that. Yeah, I forgot that.
But you know what I think the big difference is that with the internet, with broadband, what you're seeing is a whole new generation of independent creators, independent producers that aren't coming necessarily out of that traditional stream funding systems that created them. They're coming from their YouTube stars, and they're coming from much more direct interaction with their audience, and that is really good, because only people that really can engage with their audience, with their product, are going to survive in the long run.
We have time for 2 questions. So does anyone have any questions in the audience?
Which isn't really fair to you, since we started out saying we wanted to have a conversation.
I know.
But we lied.
It
happens.
All talk too much.
Yeah.
Is there
any questions? It's
sorry, I
easy.
can't see any hands. You can just shout if you have one. Anyone?
Okay,
Any
Gigi
thoughts?
Boyd, ask a question.
I do have one question, and it's about the brands, because I think Alex has something. She's thinking along the same way as I've been thinking for a while, that the money has to come from somewhere prior to you embarking on a really big project. And I think that grants will come into play, but I always wonder about, if they have that much leverage going in, how much they will disrupt the content, or how much they will actually want to make
It's a very cool idea, and I think the brands that are successful are the ones, or that have been, there was an era in England about 10 years ago when Levi's suddenly decided it wanted to have a totally hip brand, and it put a huge chunk of money into like 20 shorts that were made by filmmakers all over Britain that appeared in front of feature films in theatres. It was advertising paid for essentially by Levi's, and the only reference was Levi's at the bottom. So they got all these named filmmakers, and the cool factor came from they were totally cool shorts, and Levi's was cool because it kept its hands off. And that, for that demographic, was exactly the right brand message. There's going to be others where, Disney will micromanage you until your ears bleed.
Yeah, and just to add a little bit to that, it's absolutely true, and even some of the stuff we've been doing, brands want to be seen more as cultural benefactors now.
Yeah.
Websites aren't going to look like a bloody NASCAR with lots of little boxes on them in the future. Because the most important thing is, that you want to actually move your brand from being what Levi's did, from being a brand to what, Saatchi & Saatchi calls a love mark, where it's actually a part of someone's life in a really meaningful way. And that's like the holy grail. And that's, that speaks to that.
Yeah, and Apple's got a bit of that going.
Yeah.
Right?
A love
A
mark.
love mark, not a love bite.
Michael can tell you
Love
about that
mark.
after.
Although love bites are available too.
We have no time left. Oh, we have one more
One
question? Okay, so we have time for one more question.
Well, if no one is asking a question, I can ask one. I really
Okay,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah. So I want to go back to understanding the millennial generation. And one thing that this generation is really, really good at is getting stuff for free. And they have so much content available on the internet, and they get their content for free, whether by legal means or by illegal means. It's out there, and you all know
Arrest
it.
him.
Yeah, absolutely. So in 2020, how do we actually navigate through these waters and actually get content out there, and how do we have a revenue model that is actually sustainable and that appeals to the millennial generation? Do we actually charge people for content, or we actually go back to the toothpaste and have companies pay for it?
I think we have to. I think that the one thing we learned from music. It's interesting. Michael said you have to control your IP, and right now that's the most important thing my company can do is control its IP, because right now that is gold. In 2020, I'm not sure that we will be able to control our IP. I don't think that the costs, the increasingly enormous costs of creating some of these entertainments, not all of the aspects of them, but some of these entertainments, it's impossible to charge the individual. But you go to a Hulu, these are nascent brand creators, they may or may not survive the 18 years until 2020, but the Hulus and the Amazons and the folk like that are starting to get into paying for content because they want premium content to attract you, but you don't necessarily have to pay on a per project basis. The best of all possible worlds is I know I have X 100,000 subscribers out there paying $8 a month, right? That's a brilliant model because it's a good model for you, the consumer, because that's not so much money to watch it on every device I have, and it's nice for the company who knows they've got a guaranteed income rather than can I sell this show this week and that show next week and the other.
I think it's an excellent question, and I don't have any clue what the answer is. But it seems that those very people who strive hard to get that content for free or illegally or however want to get the content. So if somehow, for free, but if somehow you build an understanding that the only reason that content is there is because somebody had to pay for it, and if you continue to behave in that manner as a generation, which will happen, that content won't be there anymore.
She turned 60.
But here's the
The answer is simply to cut off your internet service, and the technology will certainly exist through Homeland Security to know what you're up to.
Arrest you. But here's, I think, what would your answer be? I'd be interested to know, because you are of that generation, obviously, by your age. You're a very good-looking, attractive young man. There you say. It does have to do with age. That's the love mark.
Yeah, yes,
But really, what would your answer be to that? Because I think it's an absolutely legitimate question.
Well, I think what it boils down to is accessibility at the end of the day. The reason why I know a lot of people who actually engage in such practices is because they don't want to wait for the content to actually come up on their TVs, or don't want to wait 3 days for the DVD to ship from Amazon to their home places.
Right.
They know it's available at the touch of a fingertip. All they have to do is just click a few buttons and they're right there. So if we can actually find ways to, I think Alex talked about interface design would be a huge thing. I think it might boil down to that. If we can actually get stuff out there easily, accessible, and not charge a fortune for it, but because they do believe.
But the other thing too that most people don't realize is that the people who typically download content are also more likely to buy the content.
Which is the lesson we learned from music, which is why I say I don't think we can fight this battle the same way that music did.
Although, I heard that there was a great Twitter that was floating around the other day about if the people that, take the most music online are also the most likely to buy more content, why is it that record sales continue to decline?
Because they're buying
They're
iTunes
buying
singles.
iTunes singles. They're not buying the
Yeah.
physical product, but they're still paying,
Yeah.
is the point.
And in fact, they've already proven that that's happening with films.
Yes.
So they're the ones, the people who are most likely.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I'm getting the signal. Thank you very much to our panel. That was